Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're returning to a topic that I've touched on a number of times, but it's been a while since we did a full episode on it. And after Lady Ahab, aka Maiden, Ahab, person of many different names, but the awesome content creator and writer who joined me to talk about Moby Dick, one of the things we got into in that conversation was Moby Dick and disability. And this I thought was a great time really to talk about. We've been talking for a while about wanting to do a full episode on how disability is treated in science fiction and fantasy and the kind of stories that geeks love. And I've had some stuff going on, they've had some stuff going on, and we thought this is just a great time to really dive into it. So let me just first say hello, welcome. Introduce yourself to those who haven't heard you before.
Hi, thank you. My name is AK or Ahab. I go by both in internet spaces. I am a recently graduated college student. I have a degree in philosophy with a rhetoric emphasis and, an emphasis on disability studies as well. And now I'm doing marketing and communications for a, liberal arts college in the West. So
Awesome. Well, I've always enjoyed your posting, really enjoyed having you on for Ahab, and just thought this would be a great thing to bring you back for.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm super happy to be here.
Let me start with what's going to be kind of a broad question, but I think can kind of help set the tone for a lot of what we're talking about. I think most of my listeners probably by this point agree that representation matters across the board. But I'd love to hear from you, why do you think it's particularly important that we discuss representation and when it's done right, and also when it's done really wrong in science fiction, superhero, fantasy, like the kind of stories that we geeks tend to love?
I think it starts with just a question of basic human representation and needing to see people who look like us in various forms of media. I think sci-fi is a particular media type where we're looking towards the future and worlds that we want and things that we're imagining and hoping to bring into being, and excluding disabled bodies and voices from that particular act of imagining is really harmful. And so evaluating when disability does show up and making sure that it's showing up regularly and in positive ways is really important, because sci-fi specifically is imagining a world that we're trying to bring into the present.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. One of the things that I think, the kind of thing that I first started to really notice the way disability is treated in science fiction is that so much of it, science fiction and also superhero media and things like that, so much of it is about the body. It's about either superpowers or technology, or maybe in more of a fantasy setting, magic, but it's about making the body be able to be a super soldier or able to do this physical thing or that physical thing. And or that's allowing you to be this incredibly powerful knight or wizard or witch or whatever it is. And so often in those stories, there's this idea of that part of what you're able to do is reach this idea of physical perfection. Mm-hmm. And I get the idea of it, but I think there can be a really dangerous kind of, subtext there of because anything that's broken or bad with the body is playing into some of the worst kind of ideas of disability. And, that going back to things where people thought disability was a sign of a curse from God, or that, you were unworthy, or that more recently that you were, bad genetics, and so she'd be written out of the gene code, and, all this kind of horrible stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely, I think that a lot of sci-fi is incredibly medicalized, and so that, what you're saying about the body all makes sense. That the trajectory is then what is the ideal that we're striving for on a human level? What is the kind of perfectly imagined future for the human body, and how can we push the limits of that, and what is it? And then, the moral message that gets roped in there is how do you be the best person you can morally, and then really tightly interconnect that with these physical capabilities that are fantastical and beyond the scope of normalcy. And I think to me, that whole thing explodes in a really particularly interesting way that, on the one hand, erases a lot of disabilities that do exist now, and maybe also creates disabilities that don't exist now in these fantasy spaces, and doesn't handle either particularly well historically, but we're starting to see it get handled better as people are becoming more conscious of these things.
For sure. Do you watch The Boys?
Mm-hmm.
I love a lot of parts of that show, especially the idea that it's not that there's 4 or 5 superheroes. It's there's this entire group of humanity that is. And I think X-Men also deals with this a little bit. But I could easily understand, and I think some of the superpowered people go to this route of basically feeling like not having a superpower is a disability. That now that is the definition of physical health, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, in discussions of social model of disability, the idea has always been in a world where everyone can fly, there are no stairs, which makes anyone who can't fly unable to reach the second floor, which is like an analogy that gets used a lot for wheelchair users, which, you know, I myself am. I know you use the wheelchair sometimes. And I think that analogy transfers into sci-fi a lot of the time in particular ways. And then there's just kind of no address of it.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's kind of the other point I was going to move towards. You know, and just to, you have more of an academic background on this than I do, so let me kind of spell this out, and I think this fits into the theory you're talking about, or maybe it's just its own thing. But one of the ideas that I've really hopped on most in terms of disability theory is the idea that, you know, if you have a colorblind person, or, you know, a person who has visual disabilities and they're having trouble reading something, the question is, like, do we fix their eyes or do we fix the type font and the type print? That if a wheelchair-using person can't get into a building, do you fix the person or do you fix the building?
Yeah.
You know, and that this is, I tend to hate the phrase differently abled because I think it's often used in a very patronizing way. But I like one of the core ideas of it, which is that instead of saying there is an ideal of like human bodily health, that instead it's recognizing like, no, there's differences. You know, I mean, go ahead if you were going to jump in.
No, I was just going to say, like, I absolutely agree. I think one of the big shifts that had to happen for me, both in an intellectual academic space and in a kind of more personal space when coming to terms with what it meant to be disabled, was that disability, like the dis of disability means not able, but the reasoning for not being able is not necessarily located in like me. It's not a personal responsibility. It's not a like an immediate flaw with my body. It's a flaw with the construction of the world around me. And obviously there are elements of my body that, like, yeah, it definitely sucks to have chronic pain and like those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, everybody has tools. And if you took away the tools that a regular person has and you left them just by themselves in any environment, they would struggle, because we're in a society where everybody relies on a socially constructed framework that gives them the ability to do things like, you know, walk out in public and not freeze to death, and eat and write and speak and type and access, you know, all these other things. And there's nobody out there who's not using these tools.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and especially as you put it, because we're not just talking about like high technology. We're talking about like, you know, coats or, you know, knives and forks, or just the ability to like preserve food, whether that's with salting it or, you know, freezing it or whatever. And I think one of the things that can happen with science fiction a lot is that either A, the world is presented as though there's just no one with disabilities anymore, which is, you know, it's the medical model as opposed to the social model, and as you're talking about, and I think it's like it makes a lot of sense, I think, especially to non-disabled people, but it's very much erasure, especially to, you know, because like I do wish I still had my leg, but I know many other people for whom, you know, they experience the world in a different way than other people, particularly I think because I lost mine halfway through my life. I think for a lot of people who are born certain differences, they're like, no, this is better. I'm happy that I'm different, you know. I just wish that, as you said, the world wasn't built for other people, which, to give an analogy that maybe a lot of other people can relate to, a lot of you may be too young to remember this. A lot of my listeners may well be, but I went to school at a time when all of the desks were right-handed because it was just, that's what was absolutely assumed. And I remember, like, it was my second year of high school when they started changing that. We started having left-handed desks and things like that. But it was a real shift because until then, the world wasn't built for me. And there's still a lot of ways in which, you know, I love playing guitar, but I could learn to play guitar left-handed, but then, like, anytime a friend, like, hands me a guitar at a campfire, I probably can't play it. Or I have to flip it upside down, or, you know, teach my hands to do something weird. And I don't think left-handedness is considered a disability today. 100 years ago, it probably definitely was. And it was, you know, something that, like, we trained out of people. And so I think that's problematic. And I also think and I've talked about Daredevil as an example of this, but there's many others. situations where people either use science fiction or magic or some other power that they present a disabled character, but then basically like the magic or the superpower makes the disability go away.
Yeah. I think that's like one of the things that I don't like to see in media when the technology or the magic just makes it go away. I think, using what I tend to do is use a combination, which is a medical social model, right? So there are medical conditions that mean certain people are going to experience like higher levels of pain, which is going to lead to higher levels of fatigue, which just means less time in your day. And that's like not something society can resolve. But one of the like big examples in something like Daredevil, or even something like, in Star Wars media when people lose limbs, the idea that you could replace it with technology and then it's not a disability anymore is not completely unrealistic. It's just not being handled critically, because we don't consider people who require glasses to be disabled in, most of modern society, or at least in America. Like when you go to check the disability box when, filling out paperwork for an application for something, if you have glasses, that's not something you're considering, even though by all means, it's vision impairment, and that is, considered a disability when it goes past a certain extent. It's just that we've got the technology to basically mean that it's not impacting your daily life. And that's something about the definition of disability that's really wishy-washy. I think the problem for me in sci-fi context is when, all the disabilities we know of are erased and none of the new ones are being considered, and none of the small nitty-gritty details are being considered. If you can have a limb replaced via technology, that doesn't mean you're not going to have different like sensory motor and like experiences. It doesn't mean you're not going to have to clean or upkeep. It doesn't mean it's not going to cost more, in the same way that people with glasses have to be more aware of like not scratching them, cleaning them, paying for them to get replaced, those kinds of things. It's just, that doesn't necessarily make for like interesting storytelling unless you're paying a lot of attention to it.
Yeah, it's funny, when you brought up that point about Star Wars and limb replacement, I realized, like, part is maybe because I originally watched Star Wars when I was very young, and for those who don't know, I lost my leg when I was 21, so, like, much later. But even when I rewatched, I never saw those characters and thought, oh, that person is an amputee like I am.
Yep.
Because, you're right, because for me, I have a prosthetic leg, and when things are working well, I can often wear it, and a lot of people will tell me, like, oh, you passed. Like, I would have never known, which is not the compliment people think it is. But more to the point, that idea that I think so often gets wrapped up in that, but I think more to the point is just that, every day I have to clean it. Every day I have to be careful about it. I have gained some weight recently, not a huge amount, like another like 10 pounds or so, but now my leg has trouble fitting the way it used to. When the weather gets hot or the weather gets too cold and just skin like, contracts or expands, it can change the way my prosthetic leg fits. And it's why I am... And again, we're talking about some of the struck media because I think it's okay to reference things because we're not doing a show specifically on any of these things. We're just bouncing around a lot. Yeah. But I'll say, I don't think Hawkeye was my favorite MCU show. I don't think it was many people's favorite MCU show, but I think it introduced some great characters. And for me, Echo was so powerful because, and I think my understanding is that they didn't write her as a disabled, well, actually, let me back up there. They wrote her as a native deaf character, and it turned out that the native deaf actress they found also was an amputee. And so they were like, oh, great, we'll do both. But all the stuff about her being an amputee was kind of added by the actress herself. Because there are moments where she like struggles for a second to get her prosthetic leg on, or as a child, she kind of hides the prosthetic. She doesn't want people to see it. And in combat, she even uses it once to kind of block because it's like a metal rod. Yep. And to me, that was really beautiful that in this world of superpowers, and we don't know much about her yet, but still she has the hearing loss definitely, and she also has the disability with her leg. Yeah, I think for me, one of the big things about sci-fi and like, we're depicting disabilities as like quote unquote resolvable through technology, like resolving things via limb replacement, or like, is the question of is the disabled person there for able-bodied people, or is the disabled person there for disabled people? Because like disabled people want to see other people like them who are struggling, who have like issues and are complex. And it's not just that they can get it fixed, because
not only is that like reductionary of what disability is, but it's not, then they're no longer relatable in the same way. Whereas able-bodied people fear being disabled, and so they want to see a world where if some tragedy happens to them, they can be quote unquote fixed because they fear disability, and they take comfort in seeing these characters become disabled, but it doesn't really matter. Whereas disabled people want to see people become disabled and take that on as an identity. Right.
And I think that's why, particularly with things like, Daredevil, perhaps, although I think this is somewhat true about Daredevil, although I'm not visually impaired, so I don't know if I'm the best person to comment on that, but I've certainly seen others who have. But for me, like the sort of most recent worst offender in this is Avatar, where it's this idea of the soldier who's lost the use of his legs through combat. I think it's through combat, it might have been something else, but that the Avatar program basically allows him to walk again. And it's this real, like, it's they use all the kind of horrible language of it's a new lease on life and things like that. And that really, like, I feel like so much of what I love what you said about the fear of disability, because I think that's what so much of it comes down to, is this idea of I am so afraid of that, and so I want to see stories about people who can fix that, or I want to, the same reason why people go crazy every time there's a medical story about, oh, look, there's this, new breakthrough that for this $1 million technology that I'm never going to be able to afford, this person can do something cool with their artificial limb.
Yeah, I think Avatar is one that I've definitely spent quite a lot of time thinking about, because I think I'd seen Avatar before becoming like a wheelchair user, and then rewatching it was like really interested in the moment where he gets his new body and he's running and he's overjoyed. And there was definitely a moment where like that did resonate with me as a disabled person who like had lost the ability to run and used to be an athlete. And at the same time, it wouldn't have been hard for them to work in some amount of the struggle of that disability transferring into his new context. And I was left to wonder, like, oh, this person's ability to adapt to this new culture in my brain, like, this person is able to take up this entire new world in a radically different way than all of these other people. And to me, that was inseparable from his disability and like what it means to become disabled and then have to approach the world in a whole new way and have to rely on other people and trust other people. And like that was a story that on surface level, I could agree, because I think the ableds are taking the completely wrong message from it. And also as a disabled person, I feel like I now have a really complex relationship with. And my sister, who's also disabled, has a really complex relationship with, because she's very young and she's always liked magical and fantasy worlds because they've always been a form of escape for her. And like not even ones that specifically show disability, but she is obsessed with Avatar and like the world of Avatar as magical. And I don't know if she's thinking about the disability aspects. But like, again, part of me is wondering, like, is part of what resonates here that this person who is disabled is like exploring a whole new world in a particular way? And why is that not like addressed more clearly? Why is it that only disabled people are thinking about that and the able-bodied people are not?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think there's a couple of reasons that come to mind for me. I mean, like, I do think, and the film kind of briefly touches on this, but not to the extent that we would want, there is an extent to which disability, not only is disability like a place of not being privileged, but there are ways in which it can take away from other privilege. Probably a little bit from whiteness, but not really. But certainly, like, and granted, I'm not someone who identifies as male, I'm non-binary, but I'm certainly mask presenting. And I did identify as a man for most of the time I've been disabled. I came out quite recently to myself. And I definitely found that the male privilege that I was aware of decreased significantly if I was in the wheelchair.
Yep.
And that's a whole other topic we could unpack with superheroes and like, all of the body imagery and stuff like that. But I think there's a way to which I think like there is an extent to which I think any person who is experiences a lack of privilege in one part of their life, that can lead to some empathy and some understanding for others. And I think that there's some real value there, and that's where a lot of intersectionality happens, but especially where it's recognizing like, oh, I still have privilege in this area, but I don't in this other. So maybe like the person who doesn't have privilege in either one should be the one speaking for me, even in these kind of things. And again, that's a much larger topic. I'm speaking in generalities. But my point with this is here, I think you're kind of right that there's a little bit of an idea to which Jake, having lost some of his privilege, can maybe understand a little bit more the native peoples he's dealing with. But in order for the film to acknowledge that, the film would have to acknowledge that it's 100% a white savior narrative, which is incredibly racist and incredibly problematic towards Native people.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think, to me, like, I wasn't even necessarily thinking about the loss of privilege as correlating to the increase of, like, empathy or something like that. To me, it was, like, on a very physical level, like, learning what it is to navigate the world in a wheelchair, what it means to go through doors, what it means to interact with people, what it means to like have to absolutely place your trust in your life in somebody else's hands, right? Like, it just knocks you down some pegs, and being able to be confident in a world that's knocking you down those pegs was like where I saw reflected. But the privilege element, I think, almost swings in the other direction in that movie to me, which is that he then regains this privilege as soon as he enters an able body, and like does exploit it in some questionable ways. And like, I wish if movies were paying more attention to disability, I think they would be so much more interesting, because it would be such a unique like locus point for these other conversations. Because frankly, like issues of gender and race and like queerness all end up relating to the physical body as well, because men say that women aren't as able because their body functions X, or people of color aren't as able because like their immediately identified features are X and their bodies function X. And like that whole conversation just gets skipped over, because what disability is used for is, instead of all those things, is, oh, this is why this person's here, this is why they're useless before this moment, which is so just shallow.
It's that, or often, especially in stories involving physical violence, disability is the way to show that there are consequences to violence without removing the character entirely.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Civil War, Rhodey becomes disabled, or in other things like the some of the clones become like, amputees, and they're ones who are less likely to appear on screen now, but like it's very rarely about that person's story. It's generally about the story of the others who are like, oh God, we feel so sorry for them. And that's reminding us that all war is terrible and that kind of thing. And so it's the disabled person is an object lesson instead of an actual fully formed character.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, disability as a cliche is like one of my biggest pet peeves, is like, it's just represented so one-dimensionally. It's either, oh, like, this is a consequence, this is a punishment, this is, the product of evil manifesting itself in some sort of way, or, this is a plot tool, this is a plot device, this is an angle we're going to put so that we can get this character where we need them to go, and it's not like an actual part of the characters, it's like an add-on.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, especially because, like, I know you were talking about being an athlete, both you and I lived a part of our lives as able-bodied, and then something changed, either gradually or much more quickly in my case. But that we're not the overwhelming majority by any means. I don't know. My sense is that actually we are the minority, but either way, it's pretty close, of people who are just born with disabilities, who are born with only one leg, or born with, spine problems or whatever it is. Another thing that I think is a part of this is that, and this is true about kind of all media, but I think especially in these stories where we could have so much more, is that, I had Cage Bishop Cosplay on a couple of episodes ago, who talked about being a black nerd and what that meant to him. And he talked about how important it was to him. He wanted to see stories about superheroes who were dealing with their blackness while being, and dealing with the racism that comes with it, not like dealing with their blackness, but just, experiencing their blackness and their black community in a superhero narrative. But also he wanted to see people who just like, they were superheroes and they were black, and like, it didn't matter, and like, to me that, I do want to see, like in some ways Echo is kind of both, because so much of her story is about her hearing loss, but her amputation and her prosthetic leg are like barely a part of it. And, there are definitely some good examples, but I think it's hard to see both.
Yeah. I think the devil's in the details, which is like, I've heard a lot of people of color complaining about the trope of, people remaking live action movies and just putting a black character in a previously white character's place and saying that that's representation, and being like, well, you changed the skin color, but you didn't change the story, and it doesn't reflect like the experience of black people or brown people. And more than that, like the details aren't right because the story was written for a white person. And I think the same is true of disability, which is like, I do want to see people who are just disabled and like it's just a part of their story, and we don't need to see them like the story doesn't need to revolve around them struggling with it or confronting it, but the details have to be right for that to work. You can't just slap a disability on someone and call it representation.
Yeah. No, I think it's really true. I think it's really good way to see it. And I want to start getting into more specific examples, but I wanted to tell a quick story because this literally happened to me last night. This is part of what got me thinking about being like, okay, we need to make this episode happen ASAP. Yesterday I was flying home from Las Vegas, where I've been for a magic event. And as I normally do, I rolled my wheelchair all the way down to the end of the gate, just in that kind of little round area right before you board the plane. And I folded my wheelchair up. I made sure that the pink tag is on it, that tags it to let the baggage handlers know, like it goes back to me. And got on the plane and went to my seat, as I always have. And then got off the plane and, was waiting for a while and said, where's my wheelchair? Finally, when someone from baggage, and they're like, oh, we didn't see a wheelchair. And I just said that and walked off. And then I said to a flight attendant, like, I think they left my wheelchair behind. And they went, oh, okay. Why don't we we'll get you another wheelchair so we can at least get you up to the gate. We can figure out what happened. And throughout the whole process, these folks were all treating it as though I had lost a bag, as though this was an inconvenience, but it wasn't really a big deal. And they were even willing to, eventually after some coaxing, like, because I do have a prosthetic leg that I can sometimes use, but I'm never going to be able to walk like all the way from the gate to, the end of an airport. But especially that day, I'd had some issues going on, and I couldn't get my leg to fit that night. So I couldn't use the leg, and I had to kind of explain to them, like, look, this isn't, just it's a little bit inconvenient. Like, I don't have a way to get anywhere. And, they were like, oh, no, don't worry. We have a wheelchair you can use. And again, there it was like, well, I have a motorized wheelchair, like sort of I have a specially made like hybrid of electric and manual. But also, I'm a large person. I've gained some weight, but even when I was in like great shape, I was a bear. The normal wheelchair is too narrow for me. I have a specially made wheelchair, and I finally got some people to understand and get them to realize that like getting it back to me a week later instead of was not acceptable. And they did get it back to me this morning. But I realized that like there was malfeasance. No one was mad at me. No one thought I'm cursed by God. They just didn't understand why this was such a big deal. And I think that, I think there's lots of reasons for it. And I'm not, Tipper Gore trying to like blame everything on the media by any means. But I do think the fact that we get these stories again and again that don't really help people understand. Like I know lots of people who have named their wheelchairs or decorated their wheelchairs and have like kind of the way people do with their cars. And they have a real sort of like a personality to their, because it's a fundamental part of who you are.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely treat it like it's more of a tool than a full integration into a disabled person's body and life. Like, wheelchairs are an extension of disabled people's bodies and should be treated as such and just are not. Yeah.
And I think that's true for wheelchairs, but it's also true for walkers. It's true for hearing aids. It's true for glasses. It can be. So with that, let's talk about more specific examples. What are some places where you think, and actually let's do some of the positive first, because we've talked about a lot of the negatives. Let's talk about some of the positives. What are stories where you see disability really being done well?
Yeah, it's not quite sci-fi, but it is definitely fantasy. I think one of my all-time favorites is Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's not perfectly done, but it's very well done. I think they're
for those who don't know that character, can you talk about a little bit what her disability is and how it's expressed?
Toph is blind. She is also a bender, so she has magical abilities that allow her to somewhat on her own accommodate for her blindness, but it's not a perfect system. So when she's on structures that are unstable, like things like sand, she can't feel the vibrations in the way that she might be able to elsewhere. And so she does have to rely more on others or other tools. And throughout the show, we see her both like using her working with her disability and alongside her disability, and we see it impact her life in the way you would expect disability to impact her life. And it is very much like a part of her character that she owns and is aware of and is comfortable in. And that's just really refreshing to me.
Yeah, I really love those stories. And to me, like, one of my favorite scenes with her that really kind of, again, reminded us, like, no, she is still disabled. There's a series of episodes where they're fighting on sand. Mm-hmm. And she talked, because part of it, she has this sort of mystical connection to the ground. And so that's how she sees things, is by hearing the vibrations of feeling the vibrations through her feet of how people walk. And so, for example, when she's up on their sky buffalo flying, it's terrifying to her. Or when she's on sand where she can't feel those vibrations, she's blind, Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was such a brilliant way of being, like you said, the power compensates to a large extent, but it's not perfect.
I think it's definitely like she has come up with a system to navigate the world, and it works for her, and she is fortunate enough to be able to have skills that allow her to have that system. But at the end of the day, she's still a disabled person.
There's one, I want to hear more of your examples, but there's one other beautiful moment I want to mention, which is where they find a sign like I think it lists like some important information on one of their quests, and she asks what it's about, and one of them holds it in front of her.
Yeah.
And she has to be like, guys, I'm blind.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing is that like they often can forget, but it's like, no, it still means you can't do those things.
Yeah. I'm definitely like struggling to think of other like sci-fi examples right now for some reason.
So I'll say that in the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson, which are books that I know many, many people love, I really wrestled with them because the magic system is so dense. Every third word is a word he invented, and I just it's one of those like, you learn a language by total immersion. In this one, there's no point of view character who's new to the world. Like, you're supposed to, as the reader, learn by total immersion. Many people love that. I have the most respect for it. I cannot do it. So I didn't finish any of the other books, but I did. There's a short story book that I wish I could remember the name of, but it's about a woman who is disabled, and she gets some of the kind of like magic power. A lot of the magic power that they have is through these kind of like artifacts that have magic power in them, and she gets kind of this like magical wheelchair that she can use, which is really great, but it still has problems, and sometimes it doesn't fit. Sometimes like sand gets in the gears and stuff like that, and it was just another. It was this beautiful example to me of like this person gets that technology doesn't instantly make it fit,
Yeah.
It's just such a big difference.
Yeah, I've never read the Stormlight Archives, but I have heard good things about it. Yeah. I think one of the other characters that I was trying to like jog my brain about characters in sci-fi. I do really enjoy X-Men. I think that a lot of people have read X-Men as like a analogy for queerness, and I think I always read it as an analogy for disability. Disability was present in my life, like in family members, and I was like chronically ill from birth. And I did always read X-Men as an analogy for disability, but more specifically, there are like X-Men who are disabled, like Professor X. And I think that's a space where representation is done very diversely across a broad group of people, and like disability is done very diversely across a broad group of people.
For sure. And this story isn't told perfectly, but one thing I do really appreciate in the X-Men, I think it's in Days of Future Past where this is brought up, but basically there's a point in time where he's able to take drugs that allow him to walk again, but they also suppress his mutant abilities.
Yep.
And that at some point in time, he chooses willingly to go back to being unable to use his legs in order to also have the mental power. And it's not really touched on, but it's a powerful lesson of like, being in a wheelchair is not the end of the world.
Yep.
And sometimes like it could be, because I think that is off, again, it's the like, well, anything is better than being in a wheelchair. Like, and for Professor X, it's like, no, that's not true.
Yeah. I think the other story that definitely like stuck with me quite a bit was, not all the mutants have abilities that are considered favorable, and I do not remember her name now for some ridiculous reason, but like the girl who touches
Rogue.
people, Rogue. And the storyline where it's like, oh, we have the ability to cure mutants, and you know she's interested in that and gets in line, and there are other mutants who are like, what are you doing? Why would you do that? Seems resonant of discussions that happen in disabled communities all the time, because like there are deaf people who think cochlears are like, you know, destroying the deaf community, and then there are deaf people who are like, cochlears are allowing people to hear again, this is amazing. And it's so much more complicated than a fix-all solution that is a lot of time presented in media.
I think that's so true. And I think with deafness especially, I know many, not all, but many deaf people don't even consider that to be a disability. They consider it just to be a difference.
Yep.
And so it's always a little tricky talking about it. But I think you're right. It's a very good, in many ways, that plot line, which I know is told both in comics and in the animated show and in the movies, is a great analogy for that in the deaf community, but also in a lot of other communities. You know, I think there's definitely like, I am happy being on my prosthetic leg quite a lot. Excuse me. I am happy being on my prosthetic leg quite a lot. I know amputees who just don't ever want it. I know other people who have, you know, like nerve damage to their legs or something like that, and they could learn to walk with crutches or something like that, but they've chosen very consciously not to. And I think these are all viable options.
Yeah, I think, the genetic condition I have is Ehlers-Danlos, and it's like incredibly complex and incredibly painful. And for me, it manifests mostly as just extreme amounts of pain and an inability to walk or stand. And people often ask me, like, if you could press a button, like, to make it go away, would you? And I'm honestly surprised that I think 99% of the time my answer is actually no. That I do think being a disabled person is like a way of life that has just changed me so drastically in positive and neutral ways that I now value, that like I wouldn't undo it, and I wouldn't go back and like say it had never happened. But then there are definitely the days where I'm like, I'm just in so much pain that I would do anything to make this stop. And it's that's what I like about, you know, things going on in particularly the X-Men universe, is that it does go back and forth and it does fluctuate. And the superhero abilities are seen at the same time, both like new types of disabilities and new types of like superhero powers, which is, I think, something that's maybe going to become a discussion in The Boys at some point, or in that universe at some point. So I'm interested to see where that goes. Me too
For sure. And it's funny, you were talking about those reasons. I perhaps this is a little more self-focused, but I was thinking, well, if I get my legs back, I don't get to cut the line all the time when I like fly or things like that. My now spouse said that she was she made a joke of like, we should get married someday. The first time we flew to Japan, and just there was this like 2-hour customs line, and we just like cut right through it. But also all that, you know, as I said before, like, I don't think I would have my understanding of toxic masculinity, and like I even though I'm not male, I was very, and this is such a sticky topic. I want to be very clear. I'm only speaking for myself. There are many trans people who were never enculturated into the gender that they were assigned at birth.
Absolutely.
I was. I absolutely was raised and had a lot of toxic masculinity and the attendant male privilege ingrained in me. And I've had a long journey of unpacking it and breaking it down, and a journey that isn't over and will probably continue most of my life. But my disability has been a really big part of that. In a way that I think is super important.
I mean, I was assigned female at birth. I identify mostly as female now. And I had a lot of toxic masculinity that needed unpacking by nature of just like the area I grew up in. And I do think disability contributed to that unpacking, and contributed to like understanding even what people of color are talking about, or immigrants are talking about, when like they talk about being hyper visible. It's like, oh, I was in a wheelchair and suddenly everybody was staring at me, and like, oh, this is what people mean. And like, we shouldn't have to have disabled experiences to be able to understand those things. And like, it's an unfortunate thing that like I had to become disabled to understand that. And I there's no guarantee I wouldn't have come to understand it at some point anyway, but I was young. And I do think that like the way that disability hit me did just create like it tore down my world, which meant that I had to refigure out everything, which means I had to go back to point zero, and I had to say, okay, what does the world actually look like? And that's like an invaluable experience.
No, I think that's very true. And I think there's so much there that you talk about because it's not easy and it's not one side or the other. Like, I think one thing that can be very dangerous, to be honest, and I have seen this with disability, but I've also seen, like, I've seen this in a number of situations where people who are used to having a great deal of privilege suddenly have one part in their life that they don't have privilege. And it's that there can be this idea of, oh, so therefore it erases all your other privilege, you know? And like, yes, I'm disabled. And like, you know, that you put a person who, like, a black trans woman in 90% of the situations is going to be a lot, is going to, there's going to be a lot more struggles that person deals with in the world than I will.
Yeah.
But that person can walk up a flight of stairs and I can't.
Yep.
And, you know, but that the same thing is to be like, for them, and this is what I think I see all the time, is when it then becomes, oh, well, because I'm disabled, I understand all your struggles entirely, and we're just the same. And I think that's one where, you know, there are a lot of ways that one kind of struggle can help inform you about other kinds of struggles. And sometimes it's just purely, you know, a understanding across things. In some, it's because it's similar. One of the most important events that I ever attended was a conference that was specifically on trans and disability and looking at all the ways that they're linked. And, you know, from everything from like the question of passing to the question of, you know, the medicalization of both situations and all the questions people can ask you. And it was great, but it wasn't the same. And I think that that's an easy mistake for people to make.
Yeah, I think for me, what, like, the spot I was able to get to was, it became so clear that nobody who wasn't disabled understood disability, and then it became so much easier to understand, okay, I'm not trans, I'm not black, I'm not an immigrant, I'm never going to understand these things, and like I have to just stop at a certain point trying to intellectualize and understand and imagine myself in scenarios and just listen to the people who are saying things, because like no one's ever going to, like, I know that these able-bodied people are never going to get disability, and so that needs to be turned around as well.
But I think you're right, because, you know, one of the things I think that you hear so often in any representation discussion is that a lot of times there's, you know, all the microaggressions, all the little things that happen, not necessarily even aggressions, but just little things that your life is different that are, I can generally understand some ideas of racism, but there's levels at which that I'm never going to understand. And in the same way with disability. And I think that's part of why having these stories told, as you said, they get it wrong. Like with Echo's story, there were so many of these just little moments that I saw. And I know we're getting her own show. It might be her own movie. And like, who knows what's happening now in the strike. And I don't want anything done until the strike's over. Hopefully it's happening soon.
Amen.
But, exactly. But like for me, I know as a disabled person, one of the things that I have to do that most people would think like, oh, they lost you a wheelchair, that's bad. There's a flight of stairs, you didn't know there's stairs, that's bad. I don't think most people, my friends, understand that, like, I will often ask them for a lot of details about plans that other people are arranging, or I'll want to arrange the plans. And part of it's because I have to very carefully plan out how am I going to approach the world. You know, you know, I might think, oh, friends of mine want to go out and we're just going to go to this one restaurant and then sing some karaoke there and then come back. And I'll think, cool, I could just take my prosthetic leg. But then I find out, oh, and yeah, they want to just, you know, then take a 10-block walk to this great dessert place. I can't do that.
Right.
Or the flip side, I bring my wheelchair, you know, I mean, often if I bring my wheelchair, I'm going to wear shorts so that I can take my leg on or off. But if we're going out somewhere fancy, then maybe I should bring pants, or maybe I should bring a change of clothes, or all this kind of stuff. And again, I want to be careful this podcast doesn't just become about you and my issues, but they're worth talking about. But it's just more to say, like, this is why that kind of representation matters so much.
Yeah.
You know?
And
that I want to see some. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the reason that, like, we keep turning back to personal experiences is just because they're experiences that are not depicted in media. It would be so easy to just add, like, this small detail of, like, watching a character change their pants because they went out to a nicer place, or, you know, watching someone who's in a wheelchair go, oh, actually, like, we need to go this way because, like, I can't go that way. Like, those are such tiny moments you can write into a story without adding time, without adding additional sets, without really changing anything, and just paying attention to those details, which I think, you know, it goes to, you need disabled people in the story writing process and the directing process on set, but like just having those details and showing those experiences is so important to teaching other people who have no idea that these are the considerations we go through every day when we go out into the world. And the reason they have no idea is because these experiences are only something that are talked about when two disabled people get into the same room and talk about them.
Well, and I think that's so true. And the more I think about it, I also wonder, you know, if I as a white person watch a story of racism, I want to empathize, I want to sympathize, but there's some part of me that's always going to know that not only am I not Black, I'm never going to be Black.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to be Indigenous. And I think for a lot of people that it makes it almost safe to watch that because it's never going to be you. The medical reality is, I don't know, there's some statistic I saw that said 100%. I don't think that's true, but a huge amount of people will become disabled at some point in their life, either temporary, like, and it might just be like you badly break your ankle and so you're in a wheelchair for a year or 6 months or even just a month. Or it could be, just that one doctor's visit where all of a sudden they tell you, your eyes are really starting to fail or something in your brain is changing. Or, just you fall down a flight of stairs and your knee's never quite the same again. And so I do wonder if maybe that's also part of it, is that because like what you said about the fear, I wonder if this is part of that fear, is that it's because most people on some level know anyone could become disabled at any time in a way that's not true for a lot of the other kind of areas of privilege.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the hesitations of putting disabled people on screen and seeing them have any sort of complication. I also do just think it comes down to like people treat disabled people like they're aliens, and like and the presence of disabled people in sci-fi like shows that like they literally just have no idea where to even start, because your average person has no idea that like I pay attention to which doors are slightly wider in buildings so that I have a lower probability of bumping into a door when I go in and out of it just because it's awkward. And like you're literally seeing the world in a different way that people are just absolutely not thinking about, because no one's thinking about the nitty-gritty detail of like, oh, what does it mean to have this character without an arm put on a shirt, and would they put it on differently?
There's a trope, I think, in a lot of science fiction or fantasy, and like the Jedi Temple is definitely like this, where you see characters sort of like walking up this long flight of stairs, and it's a way to show like, often not a flight of stairs, but like outdoor stairs. And it's a way to show like the majesty of this building. And I've always wondered, where's the wheelchair entrance to the Jedi Temple? Like I hope there is one, but we're certainly never going to see it. All we see is, Go ahead.
I was actually thinking about that exact thing, O'Dave, because, oh my goodness, I cannot remember his name. There's another disabled TikTok creator, and I will try and get their name to you after this, because I'll go look it up and find it. And they make videos that are like, would it be accessible or not? Or like, would they be an ally or not? And one of the things that came up was like the Death Star is like almost absolutely accessible. And I was like, oh yeah, we never put stairs, like with the exception of like Gothic kind of aesthetics. A lot of times in sci-fi, the places without stairs are really clean and sterile and evil looking, and like where the scientists are and the bad guys are because they lack detail and sophistication. And so there's no stairs. And it's like, oh,
that's so interesting.
It was just something that I was thinking about, because in Star Wars specifically, all the bad guy places are super like clean and like almost hospital-y and really accessible looking. And all the good guy places, I mean, partially by nature of the fact that like in a rebellion on the run, but they're all way less accessible looking because they're grittier and in these old ancient areas that are like super leveled and sprawling. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's very true. Like, and it's one thing I was thinking about recently, because, I was trying to think where I was. Oh, I was in this convention center hotel over the weekend when I was in Vegas, and for some reason I just kept noticing the, fire safety signs. And one thing they all said is, in case of fire, use stairs. Yeah. Which is just, and I get that. It's not that, of all the ways that I want buildings to be disability, made more accessible, making the elevators fireproof is pretty low down on my list, but it's just one more of those things. I'm glad we brought up that, because I do want to talk about, as kind of the last topic, because I kind of think it's going to tie everything together, because I know you and I are both such huge Star Wars fans, and we've joked a lot about this. We talked a little bit about with the amputees and things like that, but overall, how do you feel like Star Wars handles disability?
I think that in a lot of ways, okay, I think the original trilogy is super, super problematic, mostly because of the fact that Luke's losing his hand is then portrayed as his, like, similarity with Vader, and Vader is portrayed as monstrous because of the fact that he is largely made of robotic components, and, like, that whole analogy going on there, don't like it. I think in more recent years, Star Wars has gotten much better. I think the prequels did a much better job. I think we see Anakin, you know, losing his hand and kind of dealing with that a little bit more. I think we see, just health portrayed a little bit more in the prequels. And then I think by the time we've gotten to Disney owning Star Wars, I know there are several novelizations that really intricately and well, like in a well-done way, handle disability. I think there are a couple episodes of the Clone Wars where we see disabled people a little bit more favorably. I think things like Rogue One and Saw Gerrera was a good, like, this person is clearly disabled. I have no idea how. I don't know the specifics at all, but they're just here and they're just being disabled. And it's not a part of the story at all, but that was just refreshing to see. I know Saw Gerrera is, his portrayal is not necessarily entirely positive, but, like, for me, I was just like, oh, cool, disabled person. And I think they're getting better at it. And I think that it's a complex bag of beans, because Star Wars is so all over the place when it comes to representation of all forms and its development since the 70s.
Yeah, it's a story that's been told over more than 45 years. And it's so interesting, though, because some of the examples you brought up, like Saw, I had a wildly different interpretation of, because, you know, he walks with a limp, and actually he has a prosthetic leg, which is, you know, I think, awesome. That was cool to see. But the way his body is mechanicized, especially like the way he sort of uses a breathing mask, to me is very reminiscent of Darth Vader. And I thought that was supposed to represent, that because, how Anakin fell is by, wanting to go to extreme methods to do what he thought was right. And then, of course, also protecting Padme. Yeah. And that's kind of Saw's problem here, is that he's also willing to, like, torture people to find out if they are spies or they're here to help him and that kind of thing.
Yep.
But I think it's here's the thing. It's because we have so few characters. Right. That it's like, oh, yeah, well, that's one of the three.
Yeah. I think a lot of times for me, I'm just like, oh, I'm so refreshed to see a disabled character. And I'm not even thinking about, like, oh, how are the ableds going to read this in terms of, like, this is supposed to be a negative. Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, I get that. And I definitely agree with you on the original trilogy. Although I would say, and granted, perhaps I'm overly critical of the prequels, and that's a very fair comment to make. I think the most, like, ableist moment in all of Star Wars comes in the prequels. Because, to me, I think some of the best disability representation in the original trilogy is Yoda.
Yes,
because Yoda is kind of stumped older. He walks with a cane, which, is a kind of disability. And he still has this incredible power to lift this X-Wing out from a swamp, let alone to, like, read the future and to help train Luke and all these things. We again see him as this, like, disabled person using a cane. He can't really even stand upright all the time. And then it becomes time for the lightsaber battle. Yeah. And he just throws his cane away and becomes this acrobatic little green ball bouncing around the lightsaber. And everyone else thought this was so cool. And I was so angry.
Yeah, I think I started to think about Yoda as you were talking, and I thought about him in the context of the original trilogy in positive. I didn't even think about the prequel implication. I think I go so far back and forth, because, like, my initial reaction to that, I think, was like, oh, why is he doing, like, it just felt out of place. But I am also an ambulatory wheelchair user who, and I'm not sure if I could do this now, but I think a year and a half ago, like in the recent past, while I was using a wheelchair full time, was training 2-3 times a week over the summer in Taekwondo and got my 3rd degree black belt, because I would just use my wheelchair all day long, and the very little energy that I had all went into this project. And it was very limited. I had maybe an hour or two where I could perform at that level, and then it fell apart and I was in excruciating pain the next day, but this was something that I wanted to work towards. And to me, in that initial fight with Dooku and later in the fight with Palpatine, Yoda is pretty exhausted by the end. And I think they do it a little better in the fight with Dooku than they do in the fight with Palpatine. And it definitely feels out of place in a lot of ways, but I'm not.
Yeah.
And I don't, and the other thing is, I also know there's no way the writers of the show was thinking about it in that way, and it could have been treated in a much more nuanced and interesting way that would have depicted ambulatory or dynamic disability. But I think to me, there was something kind of relieving about, this disabled character can tap into the Force for these moments of energy where they really need to perform at a level that they otherwise cannot. And particularly as a martial artist, that was interesting to me. Even though obviously it's beyond the pale.
I think I can definitely understand that, and that makes a lot of sense. And I like you. I'm also ambulatory, and then I use my prosthetic leg a lot. I'm using it less these days, but and again, that's the kind of planning for me. Often is the way you were kind of like planning your day around this. If I'm going on a 4-day trip and I know this night we're going to go out dancing, I'll be like, okay, so I will absolutely not use my leg except for that because it's both saving up energy, but it's also like I start to get scabs. I mean, there's this whole other thing.
Yep.
And I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying before. It's not that I would say like, no, Yoda has to use the cane always and forever. It's that I just want that one line of dialogue.
Yep.
It's that, Bail Organa coming to him in the ship and being like, are you okay? And he say, I had to draw deeply on the Force so that I could use my body to fight. And now I really have to rest. Some acknowledgement that his fighting was radically different than his using the cane, and that there's a cost to him of using all of that, energy or spoons or whatever the heck, or force or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, that goes back to there's so many different ways to portray disability. It's kind of hard to get it so unbelievably wrong. The question is, what's the message? What's the story? What's the reasoning? And is this an add-on, or is this a part of the character? And if it's a part of the character, why are there not these little details that there absolutely could and should be to send a clear message to your audience that, this person is disabled, and that's okay, and we're not using this as a metaphor or an allegory or a negative or a drawback or a weird add-on to create some sort of effect.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think it's as I said before, it's very clear there wasn't a disabled person in that writing room.
Yeah.
I don't think it was written in a writing room, and I think the writing of, never mind. I think, and I don't think they were trying to tell a story about how Yoda is a person of variable ability, and a fluid ability. I think they just thought watching a little green ball of fur bounce around with a lightsaber would look really cool, so let's do it, and didn't think about what the implications were.
I agree.
Well, this has been such a good discussion. I'm really glad we got to have it. I know we just barely scratched the surface, but I hope we gave listeners kind of a good introduction. Is there any other last points that you want to bring up? And I will say for our members, we're going to talk a little bit more about Ahab and disability in the members-only section. But just in general, kind of any other last points you wanted to make?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think, at the end of the day, for me, sci-fi representation and any representation of disability just comes down to, have you interacted with disabled people, and are you considering disabled people as disabled people, not just people with a disability slapped onto them?
Yeah. And I think the phrase people there is so important because, like you said, you and I have share a lot of similar opinions, but also probably see some things differently. So, you might go to one disabled person who, I know there are, some visually impaired people who, understand the story of Daredevil and think it's absolutely amazing. And some who think it's incredibly, offensive. And a lot of people who are like, yeah, it's just not, it's a fun story, but it's not the best. I don't feel represented in it. And yeah, so it seems like with any community, it's important not just have your one disabled friend, but all the rest of it. Well, thank you as always so much. For people who want to find more of the cool content you're putting out, where can they find you?
Yeah, I am on Instagram. I do art at Iron Kingdom Adventures, and then I'm on TikTok at AK Maiden.
Yeah, definitely worth checking out. Really glad I love all your content. Love following it. Definitely encourage other people to do so. And of course, you should follow our content. We're active on TikTok, on Twitter. I may be doing more stuff on Facebook again. I kind of dropped out for a little while, but I may be doing that again. But also, you can certainly email us. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Love to hear your comments. If you're disabled, like who are characters that have really felt did represent you or didn't? What are the points of the conversation we missed out? If you're able-bodied or just, it's not two firm boxes. There's lots of middle ground. But wherever you sit, what did you think about this discussion? What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? What did you wish we touched on or think we should have approached a different way? Write in. We'd love to hear us. And of course, also, if you just go to The Ethical Panda, you'll get there. But also, if you just follow the links in the show notes, there especially you can find out how to become a member. It's only $5 a month, and membership gets you ad-free content, bonus content, and it's just a great way to support the show. So, AK, thank you again so much. For everyone else, we have spoken.